if I say something too slowly. I'm happy to answer questions, clarify things, make sure that this is as useful for folks who are in attendance and who are maybe less familiar with our dashboards. So we'll just go ahead and get started. I think I'm hearing a little bit of echo from Mike. I might just ask to mute. There we go. Okay. All right, cool. So let's go ahead and get started. So today I'm going to be talking about the Alabama Water and Wastewater Rates Dashboard. This is something that we have done in the state of Alabama a few times now, and this is actually a webinar that I've given in the past for the state of Alabama. It was on obviously a different rate or a different year of rates, but a very similar structure to the dashboard itself. So today's session will take about an hour. I encourage y'all, if you have questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat or just kind of jump in and ask questions as I'm going along. Either of those are fine. Just, happy to make this as interactive as possible. All right, so let's get started. So just some quick webinar logistics. So we are running this via Zoom. We actually have it set up as a Zoom meeting. So you do have the option to speak if you want to speak at any point. If you want to mute or unmute within Zoom, you should have the little microphone guy in the bottom left-hand corner. You can just click that. That's how you mute or unmute. That's probably the easiest way to quickly speak if you have something that you want to share. I'm sure at this point, y'all are probably very familiar with Zoom, so this is probably just maybe a bit of overkill, but if you want to turn your camera on or off, there's the start video button. I think I have it defaulted to have it off, but you're welcome to do whatever you want in that front. If you want to react to something, Zoom does have reaction functions now, so you can click the little up caret, the little caret here next to the smiley face if you wanted to react. If you wanted to raise your hand, that's also within that function as well. And then if you want to get to the chat, at least on my screen, whenever I just have the default Zoom up, it does not show me the chat function, but you can click on that more button and that'll take you to the chat function if you want to add something to the chat. Additionally, if you want to leave, obviously you could just hit the end button right there. And then if you want to change views, so you can change the view in Zoom. So if you want to see, everyone who's part of it, if you want to just see, your face, if you want to see a smaller number of folks, you can do all that by clicking in the upper right-hand corner to change the view. So just a brief background about the Environmental Finance Center at UNC-Chapel Hill. We've been around for about 25 years, and we are housed within the UNC School of Government. So a lot of our work is working with local governments and with state governments. And our mission is to support fair, effective, and financially sustainable delivery of environmental programs and services. And we do that through a variety of different, practices, that one being applied research. We do program design and evaluation. We do some teaching and outreach. So we teach classes within the UNC School of Government for practitioners. And then we also are obviously on a large campus, so have the opportunity to teach undergraduate and graduate students as well. We do some advising, so we work a lot with states on really just doing kind of research on their existing programs and providing some recommendations and advice on how to improve those. And then we do policy analysis as well. And for the purposes of this webinar and for this dashboard, we partnered with ADEM to put together, basically what I'll be sharing with you today. And so a little bit about me. Why am I here talking to you today? What makes me the person that comes and talks to you about dashboards? My name is Austin Thompson-Spain. I am an associate director at the UNC-Chapel Hill Environmental Finance Center. I've been here in different capacities for about 5 years, actually going on 6 years at this point, but recently moved into the associate director role in the fall. And I have actually worked on the Alabama dashboard, not this iteration, but the previous iteration, as well as putting together dashboard rates reports. I've done countless presentations on dashboards and have worked directly with states on some of the analysis that can coincide with the work that we do. So if you have any questions about the UNC Environmental Finance Center, about any of the other services that we provide, or questions about this specific webinar, you're welcome to call me. I do work, kind of a hybrid work style, so you maybe only catch me in the office a few days a week, but you're always welcome to email me. I'm always checking my email, always happy to respond, answer questions. And if I don't have the right answer, I can certainly point you to someone who does. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today? today we're going to kind of go through these 4 key parts. So I'm going to start by just giving a brief background of the survey process that we use to put together a rates dashboard. I'm going to walk you through the different components of the Alabama Water and Wastewater Rates Dashboard so that you can get familiar with all of the different features that it includes. We're going to talk about how to compare rates with others and how to do that within the functionality of the dashboard, and also kind of our perspective on how to compare rates. We know that utilities want to compare rates, and so we want utilities not necessarily to just compare to the system that's right next door, but try to compare to a system that is similar, right? That maybe has characteristics that shape their cost of service, and thus is maybe a better comparison whenever we're thinking about side-by-side rates. And then I'll just talk about some additional resources that might be helpful within the context of communicating about rates, or just thinking a little bit more holistically about the financial sustainability of a water or wastewater system. All right, so just to start, who was in the survey group? So I'm just talking about the most recent iteration of the Alabama Water and Wastewater Rates Dashboard. In that survey group, we had 387 utilities within the state of Alabama. And of those, we had 542 rate structures. So utilities often have more than one rate structure. They may have different customer classes. So they might have residential customers and commercial customers and industrial customers. And so they might have different rate structures for those different customers. And so that's why the number of rate structures is quite large in comparison to the number of utilities. We also included, of those 387 utilities, includes about 77% of the utilities in Alabama. So we did have a relatively large response rate in terms of just the general scope of utilities in the state. And the table to the right shows you kind of the general breakdown of our respondents based on the type of service provider that they are. So just under half of the utilities within our survey are municipalities. The second largest is those not-for-profit utilities. 24% fell into the other category, which basically captures anything other than these 3 categories here. And about 4% of our utilities were counties or districts. So again, just kind of reflective of the population that I'll be talking about today whenever I'm talking about the dashboard itself. And then in terms of the types of services that the utilities within our dashboard provide, you can see about 181 provide water only. 170 provide water and wastewater, but only 18 provide wastewater only. So very few of the utilities within our survey provide only wastewater services. Far more provide water or water and wastewater. So the process of putting together a water and wastewater rates dashboard involves a lot of phone calls. So we often employ a bunch of students who help us call, email utilities across the state, as well as do an extensive web scour to try to find rates, whether it be on their website as part of their most recent budget, or maybe just sending a quick email or making a quick call to someone at the utility to say, hey, we are conducting the survey on behalf of ADEM to put together a water and wastewater rates dashboard. We would love it if you could send us your most recent rates so that we can build this dashboard. And so we collect all of those rates. We break them down into rate structures, which I described before, and we enter them into a database. And again, it's a pretty streamlined process at this point. The actual entering into the database, we fine-tuned the way that we do that so that we can more efficiently put together these water and wastewater rates dashboards. Once we pull in the data from utilities, we merge that with secondary data sources. And so in addition to just the general rates data that I just described, we pull in data from US EPA, from the Safe Drinking Water Information System, or SIDWIS. That's where we get information on the number of service connections or the service population that a utility might represent. Additionally, we pull in data from USGS so that we know what watershed that a utility falls in. That can sometimes affect the rates that they charge if they're subject to additional nutrient rules or if they're in a nutrient-sensitive watershed. And then we also pull in data from the US Census Bureau. And the US Census Bureau data allows us to understand things like the median household income in the community, the poverty rate, the population of the community, things of that nature, that can help us really situate the rates in the local context so that we can understand what is an affordable rate within the nature of this very specific community, instead of kind of thinking broadly about, Alabama as a whole, where the state median household income may reflect some utilities service populations, but probably not all of them. So those are the secondary data sources that we pull in. Additionally, we do pull financial data within the state of Alabama for the purposes of this dashboard. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as I demo the dashboard itself. So before we dive into the dashboard, I just wanted to kind of give a brief history of the work that we've done on rates dashboards. So we've been doing this since the early 2000s, and we started doing it in North Carolina. And as you can see from this map, any of the shaded states are states where we have water and wastewater rates dashboards. And as you can probably see, over the years, we have done dashboards in many different states. And so if this is something that's interesting to you, if you're interested in, rates in Alabama, but also rates in Mississippi or Georgia or South Carolina, you can find all of that information on our website. And a lot of what I'll be discussing today by demoing the Alabama water and wastewater rates dashboard, you can use the same principles, the same information applies to the other dashboards. So there is a whole wealth of data out there if you're interested in looking at other states. So I wanted to quickly walk through how you were to find it. So if after this webinar, you only remember one thing, this is probably it, which is how to navigate to the dashboard after the fact. So the first step would be to navigate to our website, and this is the URL here, efc.sog.unc.edu. And once you enter that website and press enter, or enter that URL, and press enter, you'll basically end up right here. This is our homepage, our landing page for our website. So if you go to the resources tab here and click the little down arrow, you'll see 4 things pop up: our resources, dashboards, tools, and resource library. So of those, you want to select dashboards. So if you were to click dashboards, you would end up right here. This would be the page that it would bring you to. And what you would get is basically kind of this general overview of the utility rates dashboards that we provide, as well as essentially what I just showed you, which is that map and list of different states. And so if you're interested in Alabama, it's sorted alphabetically. So it would be the first one if you wanted to click on that, or you could actually click on the map on the state. And that'll bring you to the most recent rate survey that we've done in Alabama. If you wanted, data or information from previous rate surveys that we've done, you would just need to reach out to us about that. As far as our dashboards go, we typically just display the most recent information because that tends to be what folks are most interested in. But we do have access to the existing data if that would be, something that would be useful for you. So again, hopefully, if you remember anything, this is it, which is how to navigate to our website. And then you go to resources, click on dashboards, and then just select Alabama. And that will basically take you to this page. And this is where I'm going to kind of start diving into the different components of the dashboard. So if you're familiar with our dashboards at all, this probably will be mostly a review for you. But if you're unfamiliar with our dashboards, there's a tremendous amount of data. There's a tremendous amount of resources that are embedded in this. It's just really a function of knowing how to use it. So I'm going to walk through it step by step. Again, some of this will be review if you're familiar with this. But if not, hopefully you will have a wealth of information after this webinar on how to use this dashboard and really use it to its fullest potential, which is quite incredible. So to start, if you were to pull up the Alabama Water and Wastewater Rates Dashboard, the first thing you would want to do is probably go to this little drop down at the top. And so I just have screenshots here. I can do a demo once I get through the screenshots, but you would basically want to click this down arrow, and you could either type in the name of the utility you wanted to see, or you could just scroll down to it. So if you click that down arrow, it'll give you the full list of utilities. You can scroll and find who you're looking for. It does default to just alphabetical order. So, a utility with an A name or representing a municipality with an A name is going to pop up first. For the purposes of this demo, I picked Tuscaloosa. You can, obviously pick whomever you want. If you're on this webinar, you might actually be on the website looking at the dashboard as I'm doing this, which is great. You're welcome to, select a utility and follow along as I walk through the different components if that's helpful for you. But for the purposes of this demo, I picked Tuscaloosa. So you would pick the utility that you want from this drop-down list as kind of the starting point. And whenever you picked the utility that you wanted, unless you had picked the default utility, once you selected it, you would see a few things change, which again, I'll demo on the tool a little bit later so that you can see. But all of this information, all these dials, this red dot, this information here, all changes based on the utility that you select. Okay, so the first thing here is again an important component of the dashboard because it affects some of the dials that you see on the right. So the default for this dashboard in Alabama is it defaults to just showing the water bill and showing that water bill at 5,000 gallons of consumption per month. And then down here, because we've kept it with water bill and we've kept it at 5,000 gallons, it shows you the monthly bill. So it's $29.63. We could slide this slider up to, I believe, 15,000 gallons and down to 0 gallons. If you wanted to see the base charge, the utility charge, right? So just that fixed charge, regardless of the amount of water that you use, you could basically pull this all the way down to 0, and this monthly water bill would just show you that base charge. So you can actually figure out a lot about a utility's rates just by kind of moving this slider around. Let's say Tuscaloosa did not offer sewer service. These would be grayed out, both sewer and water and sewer, and you would only have the option to select this water bill. So again, you can kind of learn a lot about the services that a utility provides just by kind of being in tune with the dashboard itself. In this case, Tuscaloosa provides both water and sewer service, so we have the option to select any of these three. Again, this is just kind of the first thing that you probably want to shift around if there's something in particular that you want to look at. Next, below that is the map. So the map basically shows you a few key things. One, this red dot reflects the utility that you have selected at the top, which in this case, again, is Tuscaloosa. It shows you the county that it's located, it shows you where it's situated within the state, and it also shows you all the utilities that you did not select, which would be all the other little dots that are on this map. At the bottom, this rate structures compared corresponds with the comparison group that we could select from here. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in forthcoming slides. But within this box here, you could select or press this little down arrow, and you would have a couple different or a few different comparison groups. These comparison groups are kind of what I was referring to earlier of let's compare a little bit smarter, right? So maybe we don't just want to compare to the utility that's next door, but we want to compare to utilities that are similar to us. The default for the dashboard is always going to be all utilities. So it's always going to compare rates to all utilities in the survey unless you select something else. And because we're talking about just the water bill, we're comparing to the residential water bill to 377 rate structures. So if we were to select something here, this would automatically update to illustrate the other rate structures that we were comparing to. Same thing with this map. It would essentially gray out any of the utilities that we were not comparing to so that we could see who we were comparing to on a spatial basis. And again, I will demo this later, so it'll be a little bit clearer whenever we go through that. On the right are your dials. So on the rates comparison tab, which you can see here, it says rates comparison, there are 4 dials. These 4 dials are the bill comparison dial, the conservation signal, cost recovery, and median affordability. And I will talk about all of these one by one, so I'll explain them all one by one. But again, if you forget everything that I say today, except for a couple things, one, how to navigate to the website. The other one would be, if you click these little blue question marks, it will basically give you a rundown of all the information that I'm going to tell you on the forthcoming slides. So again, a ton of information is already embedded in the dashboard itself. It's just a matter of figuring out how to use it. So I'd really, really encourage you to click this little blue question mark. There's a bunch of text that pops up, so you have a lot to read if you click it, but it's incredibly useful, especially if you intend to use this to communicate with elected officials, your board, whomever might be making decisions around rates whenever you're trying to communicate with rates whenever it's budget season, essentially. So these top 2 dials are what you compare to your peer group. So if we were to come over here and select something else from this drop-down menu, these would change. And that's because we're essentially comparing, in this case, our bill at 5,000 gallons for water to all utilities within the group. And then we're comparing the conservation signal, which I'll talk about in a second, this 367 value to all utilities in the group. But if we were to select something else from that dropdown, our comparison group in this case would only shrink. And so that might influence kind of where we fall in terms of how our bills compare or how our conservation signal compares to the utilities that we want to compare to. So when I'm talking about comparing, these are some of the key components that we have within the dashboard for the dropdowns of comparison groups. So you can compare based on system size. We know that water and wastewater utilities are incredibly capital intensive, and so economies of scale tends to be a big deal. So if you're a small system, you probably want to compare to another small system, just because, again, you might have a similar rate base upon which to spread the costs associated with running a water or wastewater system. Maybe you want to compare to a utility that has a similar rate structure. Maybe you want to look geographically, right? You're curious, hey, within 50 miles, how do we compare with utilities that are close by? Again, this was something that utilities were very interested in, because you tend to have customers who maybe are aware of things that are going on in kind of the proximate area. So if you can compare by location, you can get a better idea of kind of where you stack up around amongst utilities that are nearby. You could compare based on demographics. You can compare on source water type, so groundwater versus surface water. Surface water tends to have higher treatment costs, right? So if we're, again, thinking about things that might make the cost of providing service or the rate base similar, this is an important one. And then you could compare based on certain financial components. And again, I'll show this whenever I demo the tool so that you can get an idea of what this looks like within the dashboard itself. All right, so now I'm going to go through these 4 dials here and talk about them one by one. So I'm going to start with the bill comparison one, because this tends to be the one that people focus on the most. So it's set up in this kind of like gradient fashion, right? So again, just kind of walking you through it. The bill comparison tab again reiterates what we're looking at. So we're looking at the water bill at 5,000 gallons. And just as a refresher, we are currently looking at and comparing rates across all utilities within the survey. So the median for all utilities within the survey for residential water at 5,000 gallons is $39.91. And we can see here that Tuscaloosa, their bill for water at 5,000 gallons is $29.63. So obviously that falls below the median. The minimum is $6 and the maximum is $110.74. So you can see that we have a pretty big range here. The colors are used to represent essentially kind of brackets, right? So the dark green is going to be the middle 50% of utilities, the middle 50% of bills within our comparison group. So about half of all the utilities in your peer group will have bills that fall in this dark green range. So again, middle 50% here. Next, we have these light green bands that fall on either side of this dark green band in the middle. And this is basically the 15% that's below that middle 15%, or middle 50%, excuse me, and the 15% that's above that. So about 15% of utilities in this survey, including Tuscaloosa, have bills that are lower than that middle 50%, that fall between, around $30, and then again, just above $50 here on the other side. So again, this is just kind of helping you understand where your bills fall, right? So this is kind of going to be in that, maybe around the 25th% of bills within the state of Alabama. And same thing if you were over here, it would be kind of the similar circumstance. Both greens combined, that's about 80% of utilities. So that's going to be most of the utilities in the survey. So the majority of the utilities within our comparison group, which in this case is all utilities, are going to fall within these green bands here. Then at the bottom, we have the lowest 10% of bills within our comparison group and the highest 10% of bills. And these are reflected by yellow because, it's not a good or bad thing. Maybe, that's actually how much it costs to run the system, how much, the bill within this lowest 10% and highest 10%. It's not necessarily like a good thing or bad thing. It's just a reflection of how it falls within the comparison group. So again, it's just an opportunity for you to understand how to use this dial to its fullest. This would be the middle 50%, 15% on either end, and then 10% at the bottom. Okay, next up is conservation signal. And so conservation signal basically tells you what is the marginal price of water after you've consumed 10,000 gallons. So basically what it's telling you is, what is that price signal? If you're a high user, right, you've already used 10,000 gallons, and this is just residential, in a single month, what is the price signal we're sending for that additional 1,000 gallons that you use after 10,000 gallons? And the idea here is just, it's like economics, right? People are price sensitive. And so if we want people to use less water, maybe we're experiencing, some drought conditions. Maybe it's a supply issue. We've got a lot of growth. We don't want to build a new treatment plant. And so we need to just make sure that we get people to conserve. We could potentially send a price signal to folks so that they start to notice their water use. Maybe if they're irrigating their yard, they're starting to think a little bit more about the frequency with which they're watering their lawn. And this one is separated a little bit differently than the past one, and it's in quartiles. So you basically have the bottom 25% of conservation signal, 25 to 50, 50 to 75, and 75 to 100. And you can see here that the conservation signal that Tuscaloosa is sending is quite low. It's $3.67 for that additional 1,000 gallons. The median for utilities in the survey is $5.25, and the maximum is $7.22. And the reason that you see a minimum of $0 is probably because a utility within the survey just charges a flat charge, right? So you use 0 gallons, it's $15. You use 50,000 gallons, it's $15. So that's why you see the minimum there is what it is. But what we can see here is that the conservation signal that's being sent is quite low. And that's not necessarily, again, it's not a good thing or a bad thing kind of situation. It's utility specific. So in some parts of North Carolina right now, we're actually kind of experiencing a little bit of drought. And so some utilities are encouraging customers to use less. I don't think they've instituted any sort of like pricing scheme to do that, but you could think of how that might play into the calculus if the drought conditions were particularly challenging. Okay, so we went through these top 2 dials here. So now we're going to dive into these bottom 2 dials. So if I were to change the comparison group here, again, these top 2 dials would change because we're comparing against the utilities in that comparison group. But these bottom 2 would not, because these are comparing to benchmarks, right? So these are just based on utility level data. It's not based on other utilities within the survey group. So again, I'll talk about each of these a little bit more in the next slides. So we'll start with cost recovery. So the cost recovery is essentially, it's also known as the operating ratio. So that's the ratio of operating revenues to operating expenses, including depreciation. So we do include depreciation for any of these dials, at least on the landing page for cost recovery. And that's because we often work with utilities who are trying to figure out how to plan for future capital. And depreciation, the depreciation of your existing assets, usually gets utilities kind of headed in the right direction in terms of setting aside some money for future capital improvements. So that's why we always include depreciation. And so the dial here, again, the color scheme is a little bit different than the ones that I talked about before, but you can see that basically below 1 is red. And the reason that it's red is because if the value is below 1, what we're essentially saying is that the number up here, our operating revenues, is smaller than our operating expenses, including depreciation. Essentially, in this case, our costs exceed our revenues, or our revenues don't meet our costs, which could be a concern for financial sustainability. Again, we're including depreciation here. So a utility might look at their own finances and say, actually, we're not in the red. And we hear that a lot because utilities are not necessarily including that depreciation expense. But for the purposes of the dashboard, we do include that depreciation expense. So in the red typically means there might be cause for concern, thinking about changing our rates, increasing our rates. Yellow is from 1 to 1.2. And basically, it's yellow because the general premise is that if we're just including depreciation when we're thinking about capital planning, it might not be enough to actually cover the cost of replacing assets in the future. And that's largely because of, inflation's an easy one to kind of point to because we've experienced significant inflation over the past really couple of years. But also just it depends on, the supply of contractors to do the work. When you go out to bid, it could end up being more expensive than you anticipated just because there aren't many folks out there that are doing the work. So again, we're usually saying if you're within this 1 to 1.2, it's not necessarily a cause for concern in the short term. But if you're thinking long term, it could be a cause for concern in terms of the amount of money you're putting aside for future capital improvements. Next up is this green band. That green band runs from 1.2 to, I believe, 2.8. Again, same equation, but basically what we're saying here is in the green, you probably have revenues that are enough to pay for your day-to-day expenditures, those operating expenses, as well as long-term capital improvement, long-term goals. So in the green, as you can see here, we have a cost recovery of 1.51, which falls in the green. In the green is good. We're kind of trying to use that stoplight color here to imply what is good, what might be a challenge going forward, and what is a cause for concern. And then on the far end, we've got this 2.8 to 3, and it's yellow because revenues may be too good. It also might just be that, there's something's up with the numbers. So if you were to look at this for your utility and you saw that your operating ratio, your cost recovery was listed at 2.9 and you knew that that wasn't right, that's also a good check for us whenever we're inputting the data, to just take a step back and say, hey, did this get inputted correctly? Is there something off that we need to look at? And maybe it is that a utility wants to pay cash for some sort of big asset, so they have some sort of reason for collecting this much revenue over their expenditures. But again, we just say this is an opportunity to take a step back and look at everything and just make sure that the numbers are correct, and make sure that we're on the right path in terms of how we're setting our rates. Okay, so that's the cost recovery dial. Next, we're going to talk about the median affordability dial, which is right next to the cost recovery dial. And so the median, again, different color scheme here. The median affordability dial is basically in this kind of grades of orangey red, if you will. So from very light to quite dark. And basically the darker shades of orange indicate a higher percentage of the median household income spent annually on bills. And whenever we're talking about median household income, that's data that we're pulling from the US Census Bureau and essentially matching with the utility. So if we're talking about a municipality, we might pull data from the US Census Bureau American Community Surveys for that municipality, pull their median household income data, and then have that basically be populated here. And so what this is showing is the annual water bills. Again, we selected water bills. We selected 5,000 gallons. So this is showing the annual water bill at 5,000 gallons a month as a percentage of the median household income. So this is basically telling us for the median household in your community, what percentage of their total income are they spending on their water bill, assuming that they're spending or using about 5,000 gallons a month. And you can see in this case, it's quite low. It's less than 1%. We didn't include sewer, so it's not necessarily an accurate picture of all of the water services that this household would be paying for. But this is our way of kind of quickly capturing the affordability of a rate based on easy to pull census data. And you can see here that it gets darker. When you're in this darker shade of red, there might be cause for considering the affordability of your rates and taking a step back and making sure that your customer base can afford your rates. And I talked about this little arrow or this little question mark, excuse me, before, but if you were to click that when you were curious about the affordability dial, it will show you the calculation that we use to get to all this to get to that 0.79%, as well as the data that was pulled in. So it's the annual bill, which is that monthly bill, the $29 and some change times 12. That's going to get you your annual bill. And then we just divide that by the annual median household income that we pulled from the 5-year American Community Surveys. And you can see that here it's $44,880. Again, this is it's easy to show on the first page of a dashboard. It's simple. People tend to understand it. We recognize that it might not be a complete picture of the affordability of a rate in a community. And so we do have links to additional resources for folks that might be interested. So we have a residential rates affordability assessment tool that allows you to input the rate at a certain amount of consumption, 4,000, 5,000 gallons, what have you, and see actually the income breakdown in your community and then the bill burden based on those income brackets. So if that's something that you're interested in, you're welcome to send me an email or just navigate to the tool and try to use it. It's within Tableau, so it's relatively easy to use, but I'm always happy to do more demos if that's helpful. Additionally, we have a blog about percent MHI and some of the challenges with using it, as well as why it's been used on our dashboard. And then we have a link to a report here that talks about customer assistance programs, customer affordability programs across the United States. So if you're interested in how utilities are helping address affordability of their rates, that's a great resource. It's quite long, but it's very comprehensive, and it includes Alabama because it was national in scope. All right, one additional little tidbit on this first rates comparison tab is that we have this download data feature. It's at the bottom of the dashboard, and so people tend to overlook it. Again, I'll click on this whenever I do the live demo. But if you want to pull data for any individual utility, you have the ability to do that by just clicking this download data button. So very easy to overlook. I would definitely encourage you to click that, to just, if you want to pull data, you want to see what data we inputted, definitely encourage you to use that. All right, so next we're going to move to a new tab. So we're going to leave this rates comparison tab and we're going to move into the financial benchmarks tab. So again, we can select a different utility if we wanted to. We're going to stick with who we were looking at before. And this is where we can see the financial data that's been pulled in for the purposes of the dashboard. So this is what it looks like whenever you click on financial benchmarks. You'll see 4 dials pop up, one of which, or maybe more than one, may not have data available if we were not able to locate that data. But this basically gives you a rundown of the different components of the financial benchmarks that we include. So the first one, I'm just going to talk about operating revenues to operating expenditures. So this is very similar to the cost recovery that I talked about on the previous slide. The difference here is that we've actually excluded depreciation. And so by excluding depreciation, we're showing the figure that might be more familiar to a lot of utilities if they typically don't include depreciation, which is just how much money are we bringing in day to day through our operating revenues, and how much are we spending on those operating expenditures. And so you can see here, the information is based on fiscal year 2022 for Tuscaloosa. And our operating revenues are about 56 million, 57 million, I guess. And our operating expenditures are about 37 to 38 million. So if we were to plug that in, we put, 56, 57 million on top and then 37, 38 million on the bottom. And that's how we get the figure that we'd see out here. Again, this gives you a full breakdown of the numbers that we use, the calculation, as well as an explanation if this was something that you're interested in diving into more. And this just pops up based on clicking on the little question mark that I keep advocating for. The next thing is the debt service coverage ratio. Unfortunately, we did not have the data available in this case, but you can still click that little question mark and see the breakdown of the equation that's used as well as the data inputs that would be used. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And so again, the information, the audited data, financial data pulls up to the right here and the equation pops up on top. So our debt service coverage ratio, I know this isn't necessarily the purpose of this webinar is to dive into these benchmarking tools, but this tells us once we pay our day-to-day expenditures with our operating revenues, how much money do we have left over to cover our principal and interest payments? This is stuff that folks who are lending money are going to be looking at. They want to make sure they get repaid, right? So they want to make sure that the operating revenues that the utility has set are sufficient to cover those day-to-day expenditures and have enough left over to cover those principal and interest payments. And so typically 1.2 is kind of the industry benchmark if you're interested, just because it means that you don't just have enough money left over to pay those principal and interest payments. There's also a little bit of a cushion, right? Something might come up, things come up. We like that little cushion just in case. And so the information that we would pull, you can see here, a lot of it is the same information that was from the previous dial that I talked through. Ordinarily, we would have a line item for principal paid and for interest expense. Sometimes that information isn't included in the audit. Sometimes utilities just don't have any principal and interest payments. And so we don't have that data included. But if we did have it, and we do have it for other utilities, it would show up here. All right, the next one is measure of liquidity, days cash on hand. And so days cash on hand basically shows us how much unrestricted cash the utility has on hand to cover their day-to-day expenditures. So let's say that tomorrow the utility stopped bringing in revenue. How much cash do they have to continue covering their day-to-day expenditures? The kind of like shock of not bringing in any sort of revenue is obviously very rare. Natural disasters tend to be the most obvious example of where there might be a shock where revenues don't come in anymore. But this is, again, an important indicator in terms of just making sure that you have cash on hand in case something comes up. And so the information that we're pulling, again, this audited data, you can see we've got a line item for unrestricted cash and investments. It's unrestricted because we want to make sure we have access to it, right? If tomorrow we stop bringing in revenues, we want to make sure we can very quickly access this money. So that's why we pick unrestricted cash there. And then the operating expenses, and then we do not include depreciation in that expense because we're just really interested in paying those day-to-day expenditures if we have some sort of immediate shock. So this talks you through the rationale for why we collect this data, why we show this days cash on hand indicator. And at the bottom, it gives you an idea of kind of what to shoot for. So typically, we recommend at very least that it exceeds the billing period, 30 to 60 days, and then gives you a benchmark based on AA rated utilities, which is about 1 year's worth of days cash on hand. And you can see by looking at it that it's got that gradation, right? So if it's pretty low, that might be a cause for concern. Maybe you need a little bit more unrestricted cash on hand. And then we get into this green after 180 days. And then finally, this is just the cost recovery dial again, which I showed before. It's formatted a little bit differently so that anything above 1 is quite small on the right-hand side. But this just gives you a breakdown of the calculus as well as, or the calculation, excuse me, as well as the information that you might need to know regarding the cost recovery for the utility. I won't spend a lot of time on this because I already spent time on it. All right, next we're going to go to the characteristics tab. So the characteristics tab is where you're going to kind of get all of the, or not all of the information, but a lot of the information that feeds into the dials that I just talked about. So under the utility owner, that's where you'll find out information about the specific utility that we've selected. We can see that it's a municipality. It serves multiple counties, or it's unknown what county it falls in. The primary service area, and then the date the rates were effective. So we know that these rates were effective as of October 1st, 2022. And then down below, sorry about that, you can see, again, you have the opportunity to pick a different comparison group if you want to, pick water, sewer, or water and sewer, and that'll change some of this data down here. But it tells you the number of systems, the number of connections, the service population. This is EPA CIDWIS data, the operating revenues and expenses, which we talked about before, current assets for the system, the year the census data came from, so we're using 2021 data, the average household size for the utility we're looking at or the community that they represent relative to all utilities in the survey, or the median for all utilities in the survey, the median household income for the utility that we're looking at compared to the median, which is actually quite similar, and then the poverty rate. And so if we were to select a different comparison group here, this would change because we would be looking at a slightly different, or we would be comparing against a slightly different group. So again, just lots more valuable information here if you're interested in learning more about some of the data that backs up the dials on the previous slides. And then the last component of the dashboard is this links tab. And this links tab is this is really gonna be a huge resource if you're ever looking for Alabama specific resources or just resources that the EFC provides that tend to be very popular amongst utilities. So you can see at the top, we've got a link for our rates table and report, an ADEM link, a link to the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, a link for requesting direct assistance for small systems. And then if you see that something's wrong, right? You're from a utility and the information that's in there doesn't actually reflect your utility or the rates are off, you can always click that link to email us with any sort of comments that you have. Additionally, if you just like the tool, you have some positive feedback, we always love that too. And then other resources, the Water Finance Clearinghouse, which can be helpful for finding sources of funding if you're looking for funding. The Residential Rates Affordability Assessment, which I talked about previously. The Water and Wastewater Rates Analysis Model, which is something that we use for technical assistance. It's basically a revenue model where utilities can input expenses for their utility, any sort of planned capital improvements, information regarding bills from their customers, and then kind of play around with their rates to see how they can plan for future capital improvements or just increase their rates to meet their day-to-day needs. The financial health checkup tool for water utilities, that's again something we typically use for technical assistance, but it allows utilities to take the financial statements that they have and input them into a tool and see some of the benchmarks that I showed before. So days cash on hand, debt service coverage ratio, just a great tool, another visualization tool that allows utilities to look at some of their financial data a little more in depth. And then finally, we have the plan to pay tool, which is trying to help utilities figure out how to pay for capital improvements. So it essentially lays out the capital improvement plan as well as different ways to pay and kind of thinks about it holistically. All right, so I quickly want to talk about one additional interactive feature. So one thing I skipped is this down here, the effects of raising rates by. So this is actually a slider, and you can essentially kind of slide the slider to see what will happen to how your bills compare, as well as your cost recovery if you were to increase your rates. So you can see here, we selected 30%, which is pretty high. The first thing that happens is that this big red box pops up, which is basically saying, hey, we don't know a lot about your utility. This is just a modeling exercise. What we show here does not necessarily reflect what will happen for your utility. But it is, it's a thought exercise. It's an opportunity to think about from a very, rough standpoint, what might happen if we wanted to increase our rates. It also tells you that we assume that people will use less water if the price goes up. Then that's kind of getting back to that conservation signal that I talked about before. People are price sensitive, so they may use less water if you increase the rates. And so you can see if we increase the rates by 30%, just going back to this, we're now looking at Addison just because they have a bit more information. If we go from water bill at 5,000 gallons, their initial rate was $47.70. You can see here, if we increase it 37%, their rate is now $62.01, which puts them kind of on the higher end of bills. You can also kind of maybe see this faint line here. It is designed to show you where they were before versus where they would be with this projected rate increase. And then their cost recovery increases. It goes from, I think, about 0.75 to 0.94. And again, you can kind of hopefully see that here. These dials on the right also change. So the conservation signal has moved from, just below the 50th percentile up to about the 75th percentile. And then the median affordability has shifted from maybe about 1.2 to 1.69. So again, hopefully you can see those little lines, those faint lines that show where it was before. But this is, again, just an additional feature of the dashboard if it's something that you're interested in. And then just to give you an idea of what those drop downs look like, if you were, again, we're thinking about Addison here, if you were to click that drop down, these are some of the comparison groups that you could pick from. So similar number of accounts, revenue generation, customer income, source water type, congressional district, and then some of the geographic stuff that I talked about before. So next, with the time that I have remaining, I'm going to try to do just a quick demo of the tool, and then I'm going to pop back to the slide deck just to talk about how you could use this tool. So I should have it up here. This is our website. If you were to go to our website, go to resources, go to dashboards, click on Alabama. I already had it pulled up, but I'll pull it up again. View the dashboard. So whenever you click on the dashboard, this little box pops up, which gives you a basic idea of what we're talking about and what you need to do to get started. So we can just basically pick a different utility. I'll go with Tuscaloosa again. So you can see that the dials changed whenever I made that input change. Again, if you wanted to see the sewer bill, you could click on sewer bill. You can see that these changed, these didn't change because it's the same, or this didn't change because it's the same utility. And then the water and sewer bill, and you can kind of just hopefully see how the dials change as I do that. We will go back to water, and then I'll just click on, let's do within 50 miles of distance. So you can see that now we have this little red oval that pops up and shows us all the utilities that fall within 50 miles of distance. So that changes our comparison group and changes these top two dials. So if you look at this here, you can see that it's on the lower end if we're just talking within 50 miles of distance. If we do all utilities, you can see it shifts up. So just, again, to give you an idea of what that looks like in real time. One thing I will say for this utility, none of these are grayed out. Sometimes these will be grayed out, and that's because we don't have enough utilities within this kind of like subgroup to compare against. We try to have at least 10 utilities that a utility can compare against to create that comparison group, just because it starts to get a little bit wonky talking about quartiles or like 10% intervals if we only have 2 utilities that we're comparing to. So just an important caveat there. Then again, at the bottom, you've got download data, you've got the effects of raising rates component, all the stuff that I talked about before, financial benchmarks, characteristics, links. everything that you would need would be right here on this landing page. So I'm going to go back to my slide deck here. Okay. And with the last few minutes, I just wanted to talk about when you might want to use this tool. So this is a neat tool just to play around with. There's a lot of great information in there, but there's also a lot of kind of use cases for this tool. So it could be part of an annual rate review. Maybe you're thinking about raising your rates and you want to understand, how your rates compare now, what your cost recovery looks like, what your affordability looks like before you start thinking about how you might change them. Maybe you need to change your rates and you're trying to figure out how to communicate that rate change to the folks who make decisions. And this tool, because it is interactive, because it does have colors, right? Utilities or decision makers might want to be in the green for their cost recovery. It tends to be a useful communication and visualization tool. It can also be helpful for explaining rates to customers. Maybe a customer doesn't understand how their bill works. Maybe you could, take the tool, maybe they're interested in just their water bill. You could slide the slider and show them how their rates work, right? How their bill works, what the rates look like in their utility, and also how they compare across the state or whatever subgroup you're interested in. And then for any private systems, if you have to go to a utilities commission and make a rate case, this can be a helpful thing. If you want to increase your rates, it could show, that you need to essentially cover your increasing costs. If you've got any sort of like capital improvements that need to be done in future years, this could be a helpful tool for that. And just for some examples of how the dashboard has been used, so in the past, we have had utilities who have used the dashboard whenever they're making cases to increase their rates, and then gotten some positive feedback. So you can see here, this person said the board approved a 15% rate increase for water and sewer and approved, an increase in rate over the next few years. So this is just one example of how the dashboard has been used at the utility level. Additionally, we have done, I mentioned in the very early slides that we do applied research. We've done applied research on communication and rates. And one of the things that we found is that rate increases and communication between boards is really important. And so basically when utilities were getting rate increases, those rate increases often didn't cover the full cost recovery. And oftentimes utility folks would lowball their rate increase, right? They knew that they needed a certain amount of rate increase, but they would come in with something below that. And what we found was that utilities were less likely to lowball. They were more likely to request the rate increase that they actually needed when they had a better working relationship with the folks at the local government, whether that be the officers or the governing boards. And additionally, the effectiveness and frequency of this communication had a direct relationship with, that better working relationship factor. So increased communication, more effective communication helped utilities feel like they could come forth with a rate increase that they really need. If you're interested in kind of some resources that we put together that are specific to the process of communicating about rates and getting rate increases approved, we do have a toolkit on our website. You're also welcome to just email me if you can't find it, and I can happily point you to it. We do have some additional resources. Many of these I've already talked about. These are all Excel-based tools for now. We are trying in the midst of moving them to a web-based platform, in which case you'll just have a link that you'll access and use that instead of downloading an Excel spreadsheet. But all of these are available on our website right now as Excel spreadsheets, and then we'll update that with the web-based link whenever we have it. The functionality won't change. It'll just be hopefully a little bit more user-friendly where you don't have to download, different Excel worksheets. You can just use the web-based tool and then export any sort of results that you wanted to see. And finally, just as a quick reminder, as I wrap up, you can find a lot of additional resources just using the dashboard. So if you get to the dashboard and you don't remember what the dial means, you don't remember what the colors mean, you can click that little question mark, the little blue question mark. Additionally, if you get to the dashboard and you just want to know, broadly what kind of resources we provide, you could click the links tab here. And then you'll get all of these resources that I talked about before. So these are some of the resources that I just talked about on the previous slide, but these are also different resources that might be specific to this survey. So I would really encourage you, as you're using the dashboard, play around with the different tabs, play around with the different dials, the different comparison groups. Just give it a try. If you have questions, we're always happy to answer questions. If you see any sort of issues with the dashboard, you're welcome to email us to figure out how we can address that. If you have feedback, if you have thoughts on how to improve the dashboard, we always welcome that as well. So with that, we're pretty much at time, but if anyone on this has questions, I'm happy to answer them now. Otherwise, you're welcome to send me an email. You're also welcome to email Melanie. Melanie is a project director at the UNC Environmental Finance Center, and she was the lead on this Alabama dashboard. So she knows kind of the nuts and bolts of the data that was put into this, as well as, you know, the process of working with students. So she could certainly help you if you're interested in kind of more of the nuts and bolts component instead of kind of the big conceptual stuff. So with that, I'll maybe give it another minute. If folks have questions, you're welcome to ask them. Otherwise, thank you so much for attending. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I hope this was helpful. If you need anything else, please feel free to reach out. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you, Austin.
Yes, thank you so much, Anne. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
You too. Take care.